Good morning, students. In continuation of our last class on hernias and specific hernia, we started with the inguinal hernia. Just to start a brief recapitulation of what I told you in the last class about inguinal hernia. The types of inguinal hernia are bubonosid, funicular, or incomplete, where the hernia extends up to the scrotum. These are the risk factors I already told you. In general, when I talk to you about hernias, it's the same for even inguinal hernias. Risk factors are obesity, pregnancy, smoking, constipation, weightlifting, also congenital defects wherein there is collagen deficiencies, muscular weaknesses either iatrogenic or congenital. Iatrogenic where we give an incision leading to muscle weakness. Damage from injury or surgery is again what I told you, iatrogenic, and chronic cough. Chronic constipation, chronic micturition difficulty also are risk factors for causation of inguinal hernias. So how would a patient present to you when he has an inguinal hernia? So there can be various symptoms. It is not fixed for every patient. You cannot say that every patient who has an inguinal hernia will come with this particular symptom only. So he may have a pain, a swelling. Swelling may or may not be appreciated, but he may have a pain. It could be localized in the inguinal region, or it may be a referred pain where you can see that the patient does not have a swelling, but he complains of pain at the umbilicus, or generalized abdominal pain. Okay, so apart from swelling plus or minus, pain plus or minus, you can also have nausea. The patient can also present with nausea or vomiting. So when does a patient present with nausea and vomiting? If the hernia is complicated. Okay. So complications of hernia will be dealt with later on. Already an idea that I've given you: strangulation, obstruction, irreducibility, obstruction, strangulation, and gangrene are the complications. So if he has such complications, he may present directly with symptoms of intestinal obstruction, nausea and vomiting. Or he may be having the predisposing complaints like constipation and urinary symptoms. Constipation, chronic constipation, when he has to strain for defecation. Urinary symptoms, it could be thin stream, difficulty in micturition, frequency of micturition. This is usually seen in elderly males, those who have prostatic hypertrophy. Okay. So at first, in the initial stages, if he presents to you, like when he has not even seen a swelling, he has just come directly to you with the pain, complaining of pain. So it's a very initial stage. So the swelling will be reducible. Swelling, if it is there, it is reducible. Which time it can no longer be reduced. Then it becomes irreducible. That is, most often the patient himself will be able to reduce the swelling. He is the better person to reduce the swelling. Okay. But when he says that it is irreducible or incarcerated, it is signs of patient landing into complications. So when the visceral contents of the hernia become twisted or entrapped by the narrow opening, there is strangulation, as I already told you. So this will lead to bowel obstruction, and there is severe pain, sudden severe pain. It gives you a complaint of sudden severe pain in the hernia with the irreducibility and also vomitings, and not passing flatus, not passing stools. History of not passing stools and flatus. Okay. So on inspection, I told you in general how do we examine a case of hernia in my last class. Okay. Now I will be talking to you only in specific about the inguinal hernia. On inspection, always best examine the patient in standing position. Coughing or straining may increase the size of the swelling. Okay, so you have to look for the site and shape of the swelling of the hernia. Side, which side is it present? Is it inguinal or femoral? Those appearing above and medial to the pubic tubercle are all inguinal hernia. So above the inguinal ligament. And in relation to the pubic tubercle, that is the bony prominence on the pubic symphysis, the swelling is above and medial. And those appearing, the swellings that appear below the inguinal ligament and hence below and lateral to the pubic tubercle are all femoral hernias. Okay, remember, this is how to differentiate clinically between swellings of inguinal hernia and femoral hernias. And the lump extends down into the scrotum. So that is, it is a complete hernia or any other scrotal swellings. That is on the opposite, same side or the opposite side. This lump, is it continuous with the testis or the testis is palpable separately? Okay. Any swellings on the normal side, any other swellings on the normal sides. You should also inspect for the scar from previous surgery or any history of trauma. Okay. Now this is an example of bulgings, swellings seen on the anterior abdominal wall, which are nothing but protrusions of the muscle, weakened of the muscles over a weakened abdominal musculature. So this gives you the idea about the tone of the abdominal muscles, anterior abdominal wall muscles. So when you see a Malgagny swellings, bulgings, this is invariably a weakened abdominal wall. Most commonly you get to see a direct type of inguinal hernia. Okay, this is usually seen in elderly males and also in patients who have a weakened muscular tone because of various reasons. Next, coming to palpation. First, you have to confirm the inspectory findings regarding the size, shape, extent, and location of the swelling. Okay, that as you've seen in inspection, you have to confirm that on palpation also. Next, examine the scrotum. Here, as I told you, getting above the swelling is not possible here. Why is this sign important? If it is extending into the scrotum, this sign is important. Getting above the swelling is not possible because inguinal swellings are invariably inguino-scrotal swellings. They are just not scrotal swellings. So if you see a scrotal swelling, whether or not there is an extension into the inguinal region, this test will help you differentiate. If it is confined just to the scrotum, it is definitely not a hernia. But if this swelling is extending, you see, from the scrotum to the inguinal region, that means it is a hernia and it is not a scrotal swelling. So getting above the swelling is possible in cases of hydrocele, okay, swellings of the testis. But getting above the swelling is not possible in case of an inguinal hernia. Next, you have to palpate for the consistency, temperature, tenderness, and the fluctuance. Okay. You should not at first jump to try to reduce the hernia. Okay, so first you have to ask the patient to reduce because he is the best person, as already told you, to reduce his hernia. Otherwise, flex and medially rotate the hip and reduce. Okay. Now, what this is called, I'll be asking you later on. Okay. If the hernia cannot be reduced, the probable identity of hernia is either femoral or indirect inguinal or direct inguinal. So this is the order in which there is irreducibility of a normal uncomplicated hernia. Initially, it could be, you should think of it being a femoral hernia where the swelling is extending, very huge and extending above also. Next, indirect inguinal hernias are more prone for irreducibility. And lastly, huge direct inguinal hernias are prone for irreducibility. And also, you have to palpate. On palpation, also you have to mention about the expansile cough impulse. So, cough impulse present is mentioned in inspection. On palpation, you have to say expansile cough impulse is felt. On palpation, it is felt. Okay. This is the digital examination of the inguinal canal, wherein you push your finger from the base of the scrotum up to the root and into the inguinal canal. Okay, through the superficial ring. Now the deep ring occlusion test. So For all swellings to be examined in a hernia, you should always reduce the hernia first. Reduce the swelling first. So, reduce the swelling. Ask the patient to do it on his own by asking him to lie down, and then reduce, or you do a maneuver to reduce, and then go for testing. So, where is the deep ring located? As I already told you, in the anatomical aspect of inguinal hernia, the deep ring is located half an inch above the midpoint of the inguinal ligament. Okay, that is between the anterior superior iliac spine to the pubic tubercle, the midpoint, half an inch above this point, the deep ring is located. So you have to occlude the deep ring at this point, close it with your thumb, and ask the patient to cough. So if there is an impulse seen, it is a direct hernia. If there is no impulse seen, it is an indirect hernia. So it is positive. Deep ring occlusion test is positive in indirect hernias. Okay. Next, the Siemens method. Now here the examiner places his index finger on the deep ring, the index finger on the deep ring, the middle finger on the superficial ring, and the ring finger over the saphenous opening. So where these openings anatomically located? Deep ring, as already told you, next superficial ring, just half an inch above the pubic tubercle. And immediately below and lateral is the saphenous opening. So your middle finger is kept on the superficial ring and the ring finger is kept on the saphenous opening. Impulse felt on any of these fingers, it is that hernia. Likewise, it is if the impulse is felt on the index finger, it is an indirect hernia. If it is felt on the middle finger, it is a direct hernia. And if it is felt on the ring finger, it would be a femoral hernia. So, three-finger test or Siemens test is used to identify which kind of hernia it is. Next, the leg raising test. As I told you, you should always see this know for the tone of the abdominal muscles. If it is very poor, you get to see Malgagni's bulgings. Okay. Now, over the swelling, if it is soft in consistency, usually soft in consistency, it most probably could be an enterocele, wherein the content of the hernial sac is intestines. So you get to palpate, if you are fortunate enough, the peristalsis or the gurgling in the intestines as a content. If it is omentum as a content, usually it is tense, firm, or sometimes granular. That is very rarely appreciated. You can always say it is firm in consistency in case of omentocele. Now, always palpate the other inguinofemoral region, as hernia can often be bilateral. So, always it is important to examine the opposite side also, although the patient has no complaints on that side. So, this is the deep ring occlusion test. This is the Siemens test. The index finger, middle finger, and the ring finger. Here comes the indirect from here. This impulse, that is an indirect hernia. Here it is a direct hernia, and this is the femoral hernia. Okay. Now, on percussion, this is for the sake of completion. You have to mention when you examine the case of inguinal hernia. Depending upon the contents of the hernial sac, if it is bowel, it would be resonant, unless there is no strangulation. If it is omentum and fat, it is always dull sounds. And on auscultation, you get to hear bowel sounds if there is enterocele. Okay. Now, always never forget to mention about the per-rectal examination in a case of an inguinal hernia or any abdominal case that you are given. So, whether or not you do a per-rectal examination, you are not expected to do a per-rectal examination at your level, but you have to know that this is very important for the diagnosis in any abdominal case and in also an inguinal or in a hernia case. Okay, so per rectal examination, for the sake of completion, you can always safely say that you have not done, but you know that it has to be done. Okay. What is the importance of per rectal examination? What do you get to see in a per rectal examination? Can I expect answers from you? What is the importance of colorectal examination in case of a hernia? You may just guess. As I already told you about the risk factors, predisposing factors that are playing a vital role in the causation of a hernia. Anyone? Is nobody listening to the class? Or I'll take the liberty of picking up students. Should I do that? No. You're either not interested or not willing to answer. Very good. You can answer. Prostate. That's nice. Number 1, 2, 3. Register number 1, 2, 3. That's right. You have to palpate the prostate to see for any hypertrophy. If there is a prostatic hypertrophy, he may or may not have, like he may be landing into urinary complications, urinary symptoms later on, but on strain, it means that there is straining during maturation that will give you. So it is not just a pre-operative necessitance of colorectal examination, also to avoid post-operative straining. So even after you operate on the patient with a hypertrophied prostate, if he still has difficulty passing urine, so there's always chances of recurrence. So colorectal examination is not just for pre-operative preparation but also post-operative management. Whenever there is a prostatic hypertrophy, you should treat the cause first and then only operate upon a hernia in that patient. Okay. Next, examine the respiratory system. Same reason, you have to rule out any causes of chronic cough, which again is a predisposing factor for causation of a hernia. Systemic examination, to examine the abdomen in general, to look out for any other comorbidities. External genitalia, as always I mentioned, you have to rule out a hydrocele present together with the hernia. Okay. Next, this is just to show you about the differences between an indirect and a direct inguinal hernia. So, indirect inguinal hernia, it can occur from at any age, right from the childhood to an adult life. But usually, direct inguinal hernia is always acquired and seen commonly in the elderly patients only. So, indirect inguinal hernia, in this case, there is a pre-existing sac. That is the processus vaginalis, which is supposed to be obliterated at the time of birth. This seems to be patent in patients who have an indirect inguinal hernia. So, it always occurs in a pre-existing sac. The indirect inguinal hernia always exists in occurs in a pre-existing sac. Whereas in a direct inguinal hernia, there need not be any patent processus vaginalis. There need not be any sac, pre-existing sac always. So here the swelling or herniation, there is first protrusion through the deep brain and then the herniation occurs. Here herniation directly occurs to the weakened posterior wall of the inguinal canal. Most commonly this is piriform or oval in shape. So whenever you examine a case of indirect inguinal hernia, you better mention it is shape of the swelling as piriform or oval. Here it descends obliquely and downwards. Whereas in the direct inguinal hernia, the swelling is globular or round in shape and it descends directly forward through the medial half of the inguinal canal. Okay, it's directly forward, but this is obliquely and downwards. This usually it may become complete, but descent down into the scrotum or the hernia being a complete hernia is rare in case of a direct inguinal hernia. Very rarely you may have a very huge, if there's a huge direct sac, then maybe yes, it may descend to the scrotum, but it is very, very rare. Now the sac position in relation to the cord. When you open the inguinal canal, when you enter the inguinal canal, how do you get to see the sac in relation to the cord structures? In case of an indirect inguinal hernia, it is always anterolateral to the cord. But In case of a direct hernia, it is sac is always behind the spermatic cord structures. During occlusion test, in case of an indirect hernia, does not show any impulse. I see someone raising a hand. How do I do that? How should I see that? Somebody has raised their hand. Can you please type your doubt? I actually do not know how to see what is your doubt directly. So please type your doubt in the chat box so that I can be alerted about your doubt. Okay. Deep ring occlusion test does not show any impulse after occluding the deep ring, so it is positive. Now test shows impulse even after occluding the deep ring because the swelling is arising from the superficial, is coming out from the superficial ring. So deep ring occlusion test, there is an impulse present. Now invagination test shows impulse on the tip of the little finger. Finger invagination test is also a test to be done, but usually you are not expected to do this test in the examination because it is said to be that it may hurt the patient. Now, in case here, if you do a finger invagination test, it is on the tip of the finger, then it is an indirect hernia. If it is on the pulp of the finger, it is direct hernia. In Siemens test, the pulp is seen on the index finger. The impulse is seen on the index finger, whereas Siemens test, in case of a direct inguinal hernia, impulse is seen on the middle finger. It usually is unilateral, but can be bilateral very often. But direct inguinal hernias are almost always bilateral, which may present one after the other, not at the same time. Okay. Obstruction and strangulations are more common in a indirect inguinal hernia than a direct hernia. While doing the surgery, the sac should be opened during the surgery in case of indirect inguinal hernia. Sac need not be opened in case of a direct inguinal hernia. But remember, when you operate upon a case of a direct inguinal hernia, you may have to look for the indirect sac also. If it is present, you have to open the indirect sac and close it up, obliterate the indirect sac if you don't find any content. So, in case of direct inguinal hernia, always look for an indirect sac also. Now, what is the condition called when you get to see both direct and indirect sacs in case of a inguinal hernia? What is that condition called? Can anybody answer? What is the condition wherein both direct and indirect inguinal sacs are coexistent in the case of an inguinal hernia? Anyone to answer? No? Very good. 141. Number 141. It is a pantaloon hernia wherein there is both direct and indirect hernias. Very good. I get to see who has raised their hand here. Okay. But whoever has raised his or her hand, please type your doubt in this chat box. I think I better know how to operate this chat box, but not what to do when you raise a hand. Okay. Okay. So now what is this taxis? Again, a question to you. I told you I will ask you later on. What is taxis? What is taxis? This slide is just to put the interest in you. It better not be a didactic lecture where I keep on talking something and whether or not you're on the screen, you're in front of your screens and listening to the class. This slide is helpful. So, what is taxis? 081. Movement. What movement is it? 081. You mentioned something about movement. I don't get what you mean to tell me. What movement is it that you want to say? What is taxus in case of an inguinal hernia? Yes, anybody? I said I would ask you about this in the later part of my discussion. I'm already giving you a hint what I told you. Taxus, I've already mentioned to you what it is. What is it called? Is taxus. Nobody? Okay. 073. Yes, you're right. It is the method of manual reduction of a swelling of a hernia, wherein the hip is flexed, internally rotated, and also the knee joint is rotated. So what happens when you do these movements? The abdominal wall musculature is relaxed, wherein the openings in the anterior abdominal wall will be relaxed. Hence, it will help in the reduction of the hernia sac. So this is a method of reduction of hernia. Very good. Now, next question is, why is the right-sided indirect inguinal hernia more common than the left-sided one? I said right-sided indirect inguinal hernia. Why is it common more on the right side than on the left side? Any idea? Yes. Because delayed descent of right testis. Very good. 087. I wish to know your names also. Very nice. It is because the right-sided testis is later in descent in comparison to its counterpart on the left side. So, the right testis has a delayed descent, and hence there may be a patent processus vaginalis which may lead to a formation of an indirect inguinal hernia. So, it is more common on the right side. It is usually said that way. Next question is, post-appendicectomy, which hernia occurs and why? What type of hernia occurs? You know that there is one kind of inguinal hernia that occurs in an appendicectomy patient, and why? Incisional hernia. I did not say any surgery that could be an incisional hernia. I'm not talking about that. I said which type of inguinal hernia. I'm talking about inguinal hernia. Yes. Again, 087. You're right. It is an indirect inguinal hernia. Can you give me the reason why? Why does an indirect inguinal hernia occur in case of a post-appendicectomy patient? Yes, 087. You can also try 073, 141. Are these the only students listening to the class? 123, 81, 141, 73, 87. What is CBS organ? What does CBS organ mean? First organ present on right side. No, I'm not asking why is it on right side. I said, why does an indirect hernia? Why is an indirect hernia caused after appendicectomy? Why is an indirect hernia caused after appendicectomy? Usually appendicectomy is, mostly it's on the right side because appendix organ is on the right side. I agree, that is true. Why does a hernia occur in a case of an appendicectomy patient? What happens? That means you do something for surgery for appendicectomy. During appendicectomy, you do something, you incise something on the abdominal wall that may later lead to causation of indirect inguinal hernia. Yes, the ilioinguinal nerve is injured. Nerve injury, 1, 2, 3, you have to be specific which nerve. The ilioinguinal nerve, 073, you're right. Ilioinguinal nerve injury will cause weakened muscle tone, which leads to formation of an indirect inguinal hernia. Another interesting question. Can you see this causation of a hernia on the left side also? You said right side you have appendix. So you have this pathology and causation of an indirect inguinal hernia in an appendectomy patient. Similarly, there is one incision given on the left side, which again same pathology, causing damage to the nerve, alioinguinal nerve, when you gave an incision on the abdominal wall for one particular surgery, which may later on lead to formation of an indirect inguinal hernia on the left side. Any guesses? Very good. Sigmoid colostomy. Yes, sigmoid colostomy, wherein you create an artificial opening, an aperture on the left iliac fossa to bring out the sigmoid colon. Very nice. Cases of cancers or diversion colostomy, you do sigmoid colostomy. There are chances of injury to the alioinguinal nerve and causation of indirect inguinal hernia on the left side. Very good. Very nice. I'm happy that some of you are showing interest. Thank you. Next, we'll proceed to the discussion again. Again, expansile impulse on coughing. Can you give me examples other than hernias? Last class, I think I told you, just to give you a reminder of the conditions. Can someone give me the examples of expansile impulse on coughing in conditions other than hernia? Not just hernias, you get to see expansile impulse on coughing in some other conditions also. Anybody willing to answer? Yes, very good. 1, 2, 3. Remember 1, 2, 3. It is laryngoscope. Empyema. What is empyema? 073. Do you have any idea what is empyema? It is not empyema. Laryngoscope is right. Okay, let's not waste time. Hernias, yes, you have expansile impulse on coughing. Other examples are laryngoscope, meningocele, empyema, necessitans, and swellings with intracavitary communications. Yes, empyema necessitans also has an expansile impulse on coughing. I think 7-3 has answered. Do you know what is empyema? Necessitans? Okay, let's not waste time. Yes, very good. Pus in the pleural cavity. Yes, very good. When this pus, yes, empyema necessitans, when there is pus in the pleural, 073 and 123, you're right. When there is pus in the pleural cavity communicating to the exterior, yes, whenever the patient coughs, there is expansile impulse on coughing over the swelling presented as the pus, accumulated pus presenting as a swelling in the thorax. Okay, so that can be showing you expansile impulse on coughing. Very nice, very good. Now, what is this diagram showing? Can anybody give a spot diagnosis? Status spotter. What is this picture showing you? It may not be the right diagnosis. On inspection, what diagnosis can you come to? There is this swelling above the inguinal ligament. Ganglion. Do you expect a ganglion in the inguinal region? 087. Such a huge ganglion? No. I'm talking about inguinal hernia. Since I told you how to differentiate on inspection a swelling of inguinal and yeah. Okay. You're excused. What is this kind of hernia that you see? Just an inspection to have an idea on it. If you can be a bit faster, maybe we'll proceed for a direct inguinal hernia. Yes, it probably could be direct inguinal hernia. Or that is not say funicular type of direct inguinal hernia, funicular type of inguinal hernia. Nice, very good. Picture I think is not clear. Picture on the left side, A, figure named A. The one below the inguinal ligament is a femoral hernia, the swelling, and the swelling on the medial aspect is a direct inguinal hernia, whereas on the lateral aspect it is an indirect inguinal hernia. Can somebody tell me what could this picture, figure B, the diagnosis could be? What is the diagnosis of this picture? Figure B. I think indirect inguinal hernia was the previous answer. Ovarian cyst. Why are you talking about ovarian cyst? Why do you think it is an ovarian cyst? I think you can appreciate the change in the color of the skin over the swelling. Femoral hernia. See, the swelling is above the inguinal ligament. It's above the inguinal ligament. How could it be a femoral hernia? Unless a femoral hernia is a very huge swelling, which is extending from below above, then it could be. But it is not that big a swelling, no? This is not a femoral hernia. Any other diagnosis? Very good. It could be a strangulated hernia, complicated hernia, or see, swellings in the inguinal region need not always be hernias, right? What other swellings can you see in the inguinal region? That is my motto of putting up this picture to discuss about the differential diagnosis of swellings in the, yes, swellings in the inguinal region. It is inflammatory. Inflammation of what could be this? What swelling? Inflamed swelling can you think of? You are right. Number 87. It could be an inflamed structure in the inguinal region. What could it be? What other structures are present in the inguinal region which present as swellings? Bowel. Okay. That is what is the complication of hernia. Somebody who said number 123 is already said. Strangulated hernia, wherein the bowel is inflamed and strangulated. Okay, that is not what I'm asking you. Differential diagnosis of swellings in the inguinal region. Okay. Just to raise the curiosity in you people. These are the differential diagnoses for swelling in the groin. Very good. Undescended testis. Very nice answer. Complicated undescended testis. Okay. Please listen to the class now. The other swellings that you can see in the inguinal region apart from the inguinal hernias and femoral hernias are inguinal lymphadenitis, that is inflammation of the lymph node, most commonly occurring after the hernias in occurrence. Next is the inguinal lymph nodes, inflamed inguinal lymph nodes, inguinal lymphadenitis. Or it can be infantile hydrocele. Hydrocele collection, accumulation of the fluid in the vaginal sac. In the luminocele stage, it could be infantile hydrocele. Safina Barrett's, lipoma of the cord, groin abscess, funiculitis, or undescended testis. So these are the differential diagnoses that you have to think of when there are swellings in the inguinoscrotal region. Next, so after mostly hernias are clinical diagnosis. So you don't have to do an investigation to get your diagnosis confirmed most of the times in a hernia case. It is always clinical diagnosis. Hernia is a clinical diagnosis. But in some cases, you need the aid of certain diagnostic tools to confirm your diagnosis. One is ultrasound. It has high specificity. It can differentiate an incarcerated hernia from a firm mass. Next, herniography, which is rarely done, wherein there is no hernia seen, no swelling seen, but clinically, diagnosis is under doubt because of the patient's symptoms. Here, the procedure done under fluoroscopy following the injection of a contrast medium into the hernial sac, into the swelling that you see in the inguinal region. Frontal and oblique radiographs are taken with and without increased intra-abdominal pressure. So this is rarely done, just to have an idea. That is a heliography kind of method done, investigation done. Coming to management. First, non-surgical managements always. We have to mention about this. You should have an idea. But these non-surgical methods are not commonly advocated. So in which patients are these kinds of methods done? In patients who are not fit for surgery, elderly patients, and who refuse surgeries. So watchful waiting for a symptomatic or minimally symptomatic patient. Next, a truss is placed. This is a mechanical appliance belt with a pad that is applied to the groin after spontaneous or manual reduction of the swelling. First, reduce the swelling and ask the patient to apply this or wear this truss, which is a mechanical device that stops the occurrence of a hernia. Okay, the purpose is twofold. It is to maintain the reduction that you have done, and to prevent further herniation. So this is just non-operative method followed in elderly patients who are not fit for surgery. Next, what are the various surgical procedures that are done? One is herniotomy. The other methods are repairs of hernia. It could be open suture repair, open flat mesh repair, open complex mesh repair, and open preperitoneal repairs, and laparoscopic or minimally invasive repairs. So, various types of suture repairs are Bassini's, Scholdi's, and Desarda. I'll be talking to you subsequently about each of these methods. Next is open flat mesh repair, where the mesh is placed. Open complex mesh repair. Hernia systems are used here. Next, open preperitoneal repair. Stop now. Okay. Now, what is the incision that is given? The inguinal incision is given, wherein the incision extends half an inch or 1.25 centimeters above the inguinal ligament, starting from the mid-inguinal point to the cubic tubercle. These are the points of the anatomical landmarks of the deep and superficial rings. So, 1.25 centimeters above these landmarks, you give the incision on the skin. Next, how do you dissect? Give an incision on the skin, then the subcutaneous fat, the 2 layers of superficial fascia, then comes the external oblique aponeurosis, identified by its fibers going downwards and obliquely downwards. As if, remember, you have to identify the fibers of the external oblique. It is said, hands in your pockets direction. So, that is how you identify the external oblique aponeurosis. Once you cut open the aponeurosis, you are into the inguinal canal. You get to see the cord structures with the sac and the posterior wall, the deep neck. When you incise the external oblique, you always open the superficial ring invariably. You should open it. Okay. Next, first procedure is herniotomy. In any case of hernias, first step itself is herniotomy. What is herniotomy? See, the redundant sac. The sac is opened. If it is opened, it is otomy. The hernial sac is opened after dissecting it, separating it from the cord structure, separating the cord and separating the sac from the cord structures. Usually this is done in indirect sac only. It is separated from the cord structures. Sac is opened. Opening of the sac is called herniotomy. Excision of the sac will be called herniectomy. But we use herniotomy term itself for excision of the sac. But technically speaking, herniotomy is opening of the sac to reduce the contents. But the redundant sac is excised. That is called excess sac. It has to be excised. It is transfixed and excised. The remaining part is excised. That is called herniectomy. But herniotomy is commonly used. Okay, so this is the step of any case of hernia. Mostly direct inguinal hernias, you don't open the sac. You don't have to open the sac. Just push the sac, reduce the sac, and do a repair procedure. Okay, but in indirect inguinal hernia, you have to open the sac, reduce the contents, transfix the sac, and then excise the excess sac. Okay, this is the first step. Next, the various repair surgeries, hernia repair surgeries. Purely tissue repairs, I said Desarda. Next is Scholdius, McVey, and modified Besnese. So each of these, you just have to know what is done in each of these cases. Besnese herniorrhaphy, wherein a continuous non-absorbable nylon or polypropylene suture is used to join or to suture between the conjoint tendon above and the inguinal ligament below, extending from the pubic tubercle to the deep ring. So, conjoint tendon is sutured to the inguinal ligament with a continuous non-absorbable suture material continuously with a non-absorbable suture material. This Besnese repair, modified Besnese repair, is actually prone for high rates of recurrence. Why? Because it is mostly non-physiological. The two structures that you're suturing is non-physiological. So it is again is some pressure. You have a tension when you suture these two structures. So it is prone for recurrence rates. Usually not done, but in our setup, when there is no mesh available, we do a Besnese repair. Okay. Next comes Scholdius repair. It is a multi-layered, wherein 6 layers of the abdominal wall are sutured to strengthen the posterior wall. It is again continuous sutures using non-absorbable material, or discontinuous sutures, non-absorbable material. Here the transversalis fascia, it is double-breasted. So once you reduce the sac, ligate it, and then the posterior wall is exposed, the transversalis fascia is given a slit, and the 2 layers, above and below layers, are double-breasted. So one repair is done in that layer. Next, again, the conjoint tendon is sutured to the inguinal ligament. And finally, again, the external oblique, that is the roof of, that is the anterior layer of the inguinal canal, is again double-breasted. Again, an incision is given in the external oblique aponeurosis, and the layers are, edges are double-breasted. So 6 layers are sutured here. This technique is highly demanding and quite difficult to do, but the success rate, the recurrence rates are quite less, as less than 2% in a Scholdius repair. Okay, but it is a very technically demanding, difficult method to operate. Next, a Leiter's repair, where the internal ring is narrow by placing an interrupted sutures over the medial side of the ring, the deep ring, or the medial side of the deep ring. Interrupted sutures, non-absorbable sutures between the transversalis fascia using silk or polypropylene. Why is this done? To narrow the opening of the deep inguinal ring, and also to push the cord more laterally, so that it is not, it prevents the descent of any sac further, any future sacs. Okay. The other methods are Desarda's method that I told you, wherein the external oblique again is split above and below, and above it is sutured to the conjoint tendon. A part of the external oblique is only split there. A part of it is split. When it is split, the above structure is sutured to the conjoint tendon above and to the inguinal ligament below. Lateral and medial attachments are left intact, and the external oblique is normally closed in between also to close the anterior layer of the inguinal canal. This strengthens the posterior wall. This method is still under studies, but nobody is doing this. Okay. Next comes McVey's repair. Okay, wherein it is called a Cooper's ligament repair. The Cooper's ligament, which is nothing but a superior pubic ligament, it is sutured to the transversalis fascia. You just have to know about these methods, but nobody is going to ask you about in detail about these methods. Okay. Another one is Hamilton-Bailey's operation, wherein the cord structures are completely ligated and excised. Cord structure, that is in the inguinal canal, at the deep ring and the superficial ring, the cord is ligated and cut in between. But it is in the testis, it is left. The testis is left behind for psychological reasons. This is usually done in elderly males who have completed their family. Okay. This is Hamilton-Bailey operation. Just know the names. Next comes the prosthetic repair, or wherein you use some material to repair the posterior wall. Most important is the Lichtenstein hernioplasty, tension-free, simple, a flat polypropylene mesh, a simple polypropylene mesh, usually 8 to 15 centimeters, is placed over the posterior abdominal wall behind the cord structures. it is there is a slit at the deep ring to accommodate the cord structures here. Fishtail cut. The mesh is placed in place by suturing at the first at the pubic tubercle. The pubic tubercle bite is most important bite where you have to take it from the periosteum of the pubic tubercle. Next to the inguinal ligament, it is continuous or interrupted sutures. Again, all these sutures are placed using non-absorbable polypropylene sutures. Okay, proline sutures. About to the conjoint tendon and medially to the lateral border of the rectus abdominis. Okay, this is more commonly used Lichtenstein tension-free hernioplasty that we are commonly doing. So what are the complications with this hernia? Open hernia repair. As always, for any surgery, there are chances of hemorrhage, hematoma formation, accumulation of blood. When you place the mesh, you don't control the bleeding, minute bleedings. If they not control this formation of hematoma or a seroma and a hematocele. Hemorrhage, this may occur when you take the posterior bites. You may injure the femoral vessels, femoral vein. Next, any open surgery, there are chances of infection. Now, mesh infection is the most dreaded complication in open hernia repair. Next, osteitis pubis, because you take a bite from the periosteum of the pubic tubercle, you may land into this complication. So, it is now said that you don't have to take a bite from the periosteum. Next, post-herniorrhaphy hydrocele or lymphocele may be present when the posterior sac, when the distal sac is ligated. So, when there's a huge sac and indirect inguinal hernia, you don't have to ligate the distal sac. The proximal sac is ligated and cut, transfix ligated and cut, the distal sac can be left open in order to prevent the formation of post-herniorrhaphy hydroceles. Next, hyperesthesia over the medial side of the inguinal canal because of injury to the iliohypogastric nerve. This is common in 15% of cases. Hyperesthesia over the medial aspect of the inguinal canal. Next, there can be recurrence. I said you, modified Bassinus repair has the highest rates of recurrence in case of tissue repairs. Usually, Lichtenstein repairs do not have much recurrence rates. Next, you may injure the urinary bladder, bowel or cause ileus. Next, testicular atrophy can occur because of thrombosis of the pimpaniform plexus of veins, and penile edema may also be possible, which is quite rare. Coming to the laparoscopic techniques. See, for the laparoscopic approach, these are the modern approaches. You have to have an idea at your level. Try to understand the basics of a laparoscopic hernia repair. To get into the details, you'll be knowing better if you can understand the anatomy. See, in inguinal canal anatomy, so far what you have read is enough for open repairs. But for a laparoscopic surgery, laparoscopic repair of a hernia, you better know a better detailed anatomical aspects. See, there is one pre-peritoneal space in front of the peritoneum behind the transversalis fascia and the anterior rectus muscle. There is one space, I said you, wherein we put an onlay mesh, sublay mesh, I'm sorry. So this is the potential space in front of the peritoneum. It is behind the transversalis and the anterior rectus muscle. In front of the urinary bladder, it is called the space of Ritzius. It is a potential space in front of the urinary bladder. Laterally, this same space is called, if it is in the midline, it is called the space of Ritzius. If it is in the lateral aspect, it is called the space of Burgos. Here you have median umbilical fold, which is formed by the urachus in the midline, and a medial umbilical fold, median and a medial umbilical fold formed by obliterated umbilical arteries, and a lateral umbilical fold, which is formed by the inferior epigastric vessels. So these three folds are very important in case of an anatomy, in case of in anatomical aspects for a hernia to be repaired laparoscopically. In relation to these folds, there are three foci. They are supravesical and medial foci, which are medial and late, which are medial one to the medial umbilical fold is supravesical fossa, to the lateral umbilical fold, which is a medial fossa. These are the sites of direct hernia. Whereas the lateral fossa, which is lateral to the lateral umbilical fold, is an indirect hernia. I'll show you the pictures clearly. See, this is how you see. This is the picture that you see in laparoscopically. This is the median umbilical fold. median. The medial umbilical fold, which is formed by the obliterated umbilical artery, and the lateral umbilical fold, inferior epigastric vessels lie in this fold. So, lateral fossa, medial fossa. From here, you get the direct inguinal hernias, and from here you get indirect inguinal hernias. Okay, and one below you get femoral hernias. To know better, the same picture. Below the iliopubic tract, you get the femoral hernias. Medially and lateral to the median umbilical ligament, you get the direct hernias. Lateral to the inferior epigastric vessels, and wherein there is this lateral umbilical fold, you get indirect inguinal hernias. So this anatomical idea you should have for a laparoscopic hernia repair. This is again another important landmark. For child's myopectineal orifice, it is an osteomyoneurotic tunnel. It is bounded medially by the lateral border of the rectus sheath and above by the arched fibers of internal oblique and transverse abdominis, laterally by the iliopsoas, below the pecten pubis. So this is the area where all the three types of groin hernias occur. Okay. Myopectineal orifice. Now, what is an iliopubic tract? This you have to know. It is an analog of, it is similar to the inguinal ligament, but extends from the Cooper's ligament to the anterior superior iliac spine. Now, it divides the endoscopic view of preperitoneal space, the preperitoneal space and the potential space in front of the peritoneum behind the transversalis fascia into the superior compartment and an inferior compartment. The superior compartment contains the inferior epigastric artery, the Silbeck's triangle, Gott structures, and the site of inguinal hernia. And an inferior compartment which contains the femoral canal, the iliac vessels, iliac psoas muscle, the femoral nerve, and the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. Superior compartment and an inferior compartment. So, inferior compartment is a compartment of femoral hernias. Superior one, medially is the direct inguinal hernia, and laterally is the indirect inguinal hernia, again divided by the lateral umbilical fold, which contains the inferior epigastric vessels. Okay. Next, you should have an idea about the triangle of Doom, which is a triangular space lined by gonadal vessels laterally, the vas deferens medially, gonadal vessels laterally, the vas deferens medially, and the inferiorly by the peritoneal reflection. This is the area where there are where the external iliac vessels lie. So why is it called triangle of Doom? In this area, if you injure any structures, if you put a stacker or something, there are chances of injuring these major vessels, causing major morbidity. So triangle of Doom. Next, triangle of pain. Again, it is a V-shaped area with the apex of the internal ring. It is bounded laterally by the iliopubic tract or the inguinal ligament, and medially by the gonadal vessels. Medially by the gonadal vessels. So what does this area contain? Mainly the nerves. That is the femoral branch of the genitofemoral nerve, the anterior femoral cutaneous nerve, and the lateral femoral cutaneous nerves. So these nerves, whenever there is an injury in this area, the patient will complain of post-operative severe pain, neuralgia. So better avoid injuring structures in these two triangles while doing laparoscopic repair. So epigastric vessels, I said you laterally, is the indirect inguinal hernia, medially is the direct inguinal hernia. Next, from the pubic tuberous symphysis to the iliac crest, the iliopubic tract. Below it is femoral hernias. The triangle of Doom is here, and the triangle of pain triangle of pain. The differentiating the landmark between these two triangles is the gonadal vessels. Gonadal vessels. So you have to remember this important anatomical aspect in case of a laparoscopic hernia repair. There's another important point which is called the circle of death or corona mortis, which refers to the anastomotic branches of the vasculature in this region, which is formed by the common iliac the external iliac, the internal iliac branches, inferior epigastric, and the inferior epigastric and the external iliac vessels. So it is formed between the inferior epigastric, obturator, internal iliac, and common iliac arteries. So this is again, you have to remember, any injury in this region, there is torrential bleeding and hemorrhage, which may lead to death of the patient intraoperatively itself. This is called the circle of death or corona mortis. So there are two types of repairs, laparoscopically done. Two approaches actually. The approach is different, but what you do, where you place the mesh is the same in both the cases. Approach itself is different. One is preperitoneal approach, simple preperitoneal approach, that is totally extraperitoneal approach. One is transabdominal preperitoneal approach. So here again, through the abdominal cavity into the preperitoneal space, you go. This is called TAP, transabdominal preperitoneal approach. TAP, total extraperitoneal approach. Okay. So transabdominal preperitoneal mesh repair, it is done in large indirect hernias or irreducible inguinal hernias, wherein the first step is to enter the intra-abdominal cavity after giving an incision intraumbilically. The anterior abdominal wall, the skin is incised. Next is anterior rectus. The rectus muscle is laterally retracted. The posterior rectus is cut, and without injuring the internal, without injuring the transverse fascia, the trocar is introduced into the preperitoneal, creating the peritoneal flap. Open excised up to the peritoneum, whereas the peritoneum is cut and the peritoneal cavity is entered. Again, from here, the peritoneum is incised from the lower border, from the innermost layer, from the inside the abdominal cavity, the peritoneum is incised, and then the preperitoneal space is approached. You have to identify the anatomical landmarks that I showed you before. Next, the sac is dissected, and next the mesh is placed in the preperitoneal space, and the peritoneum is closed. This is transabdominal. Through the abdominal cavity, the mesh is placed in the preperitoneal layer. Hernial sac is dissected in the preperitoneal plane after making horizontal incision in the upper part of the sac opening. After sac is excised, the vas and gonadal vessels are identified. Inferior epigastric vessels. These are their landmarks for identifying whether there is a presence of both small direct or indirect hernias coexisting. Once the sac is dissected and excised, again the proline mesh is placed. Here a larger mesh can be placed so that we can prevent incidence of hernias of any type of both types of inguinal hernias. A smaller mesh is in the preperitoneal space. It is fixed to the pubic bone using tackers. Okay. Again, the peritoneum is closed with continuous proline sutures. Next is total extraperitoneal repair. TEPP. Again, total extraperitoneal preperitoneal approach. Here also you go to the preperitoneum, but the approach is from the outside. It is extraperitoneal. The approach is from the outside. Don't have to go into the abdominal cavity. Resection is carried out downwards carefully, then medially up to the pubic tubercle. Again, the iliopectineal ligament is identified. Lateral and iliac vessels are identified. Inferior epigastric vessels are identified. Once the space in the preperitoneal space is adequately dissected, mesh is placed in that area. Here the mesh is sutured to the iliopectineal ligament. The other side can also be done together in case of extraperitoneal repair. See, the trocar, the endoscope with a balloon is passed on the preperitoneal space. That is nothing but space in front of the peritoneum behind the transversalis fascia. This is advanced up to the pubic bone. After that, gas is insufflated extraperitoneally without entering the peritoneal cavity, the abdominal cavity. Extraperitoneally, the balloon is inflated and it is insufflated with carbon dioxide. So this is where the dissection is done, preperitoneal space. This is how the picture appears after you place a mesh using tackers. I said you, this tackers, when you fix the mesh, you should not fix the mesh using tackers in the triangle of boom, triangle of pain, and the circle of the corona mortis, circle of death. These three areas you have to be very cautious. So total extraperitoneal repair, it is done in recurrent hernias and bilateral. Even when there is a femoral hernia, the approach is huge, the approach is large, so you can opt for all kinds of repairs in a total extraperitoneal repair. It is a better repair. But this cannot be done when there is obstruction or strangulation. Obviously, when there is obstruction or strangulation, you have to meddle the bowel also, so you have to go intraperitoneally. So total extraperitoneal repair is not done in case of strangulation or inguinal hernias, or when there is bleeding disorders and ascites contraindication for any total extraperitoneal, for any hernia repairs. In that, we have to know about the Cooper's ligament, the iliopubic tract. In both the cases, you have to know about the chord and mass difference and also the nerves. What are the advantages? The approach is totally extraperitoneal. If there's a small incision and you can place a proper mesh in the preperitoneal space, covering wide area. The peritoneal cavity is intact and not open. So these are the advantages of total extraperitoneal repair. But it is a very difficult method in dissecting an indirect sac with the total extraperitoneal method. There could be chances of vas injuries. When you inadvertently open the sac, so the peritoneal sac is such a slight slender structure, there are chances of opening the sac. There may be injuries to the major iliac vessels. There can be displacement of the mesh or erosion of the structures like urinary bladder. There could be nerve injuries, formation of seroma, hematoma, infection, and recurrence. Okay, so I think I have rushed through this topic. If there are any doubts, please go through the topic in your textbook. If you have any doubts, feel free to ask me in your next class. Okay, I'll be coming again the next week. You can always ask me any doubts. The laparoscopic approach is quite a difficult approach for you to understand, but once you know the anatomy, the process, the method is very easy to understand. So please go through the textbook. If you have any doubts, you can ask me. Okay. So bye for now. Take care. Stay safe. Stay healthy.